Welcome to this video in which I'm going to present to you a very interesting Brazil nut pommel sword. After a conference at the Feste Coburg in southern Germany last fall, I had the opportunity to examine a very interesting sword. Now, this sword stands out for a number of features, and one of which is that it has an inscribed blade. On one side of the blade there are letters laid into the blade, and they consist of iron rods. So basically it's steel with softer material. These composite rods made up the letters. This is a very traditional and older type of inlay. On the opposing side of this sword there are traces of three crosses inlaid into the blade, but those crosses were inlaid in yellow metal, so possibly gold, but could also be copper alloy, we don't really know. So because we have these two different materials being used for the blade inlays, Alfred Geibig assumes that this sword may be a transitional type in terms of blade inscriptions. The earlier ones, such as the Ulfbert inscriptions or Inglery, they all sport inlays in iron. And only in later periods, so in the high Middle Ages, we see inscriptions in yellow metal. So that's why he placed this sword in between. It probably is a 10th century sword if we go by period depictions, like for instance a senior officer standing next to Emperor Otto III in a miniature in his evangelistry. And this man, he wears a Brazil nut pommel sword, exactly the same type. A couple of years ago, Dr. Stefan Mäder pointed out that the earliest representation of a Brazil nut pommel is actually in a Carolingian source, namely the Utrecht Psalter, and there you can see a craftsman sharpening or polishing a sword on an according polishing bench, and this sword appears to sport a Brazil nut pommel. But it's clear that these swords were most popular in the 11th and particularly in the 12th century. So here's the so-called Brazil nut pommel. That, of course, is a modern name, and it is very accurately shaped. The tang pierces the pommel and is peened over the pommel top. Now this peening is hardly visible, probably doesn't show on film at all, but I have seen another sword of this type in Switzerland, and this one was of the same construction, the so-called Geibig construction type 3. And with that sword too, it was really hard to make out the peening of the tang. That means these swords were very, very accurately and painstakingly made. Now what stands out is the remains of an organic handle, so remains of wood still cling to the tang. As you can see, they were wider near the crossguard, and then it tapered towards the pommel. The cross-section of this grip would have been a rectangular one with chamfered edges, which is quite typical too. And it is fair to assume that the wooden handle was covered by some other material. So it might have been wound with some thread and then covered with either textile or leather. Remnants of organic handles as well as scabbards were found with swords that were excavated in Brandenburg. They come from late Slavic burials, which date to the first half of the 12th century. It's actually quite exceptional that we have grave goods from this time period. And you can see that with one of these swords, the wooden handle plates were actually covered with additional organic material. If you look closely, you can actually see the remnants or traces of razors on the top edge of this grip. So it seems like some kind of thong or thread was wound around the wooden plates of the grip, forming some kind of spiral. And then this was covered with what looks like leather. And finally, additional thread was used to sculpt or mold the profile of this grip by means of either tying it around the grip or maybe even sewing. So sewing, stitching may have caused the little dents that you see at the lower edge of the grip. In this illustration of mine, I show my suggestion for what the grip of the Stolpe sword may have looked like at one point and how it was actually constructed. In addition to the rather small number of surviving sword grips from the medieval period, medieval artwork and sculpture in particular can give us a quite good idea of what the grips and even the scabbards of swords from that era looked like in the day. While artwork from the 10th, 11th and 12th century is somewhat limited when it comes to details like grip bindings of swords, from the 13th century onwards, sculptures such as monumental effigies, epitaphs, they do show great attention to detail. This is extremely valuable for the reconstruction of scabbards, grip bindings, sword belts, and costume in general. And as you can see with this particular example from Merseburg Cathedral, the scabbard mouth is sculpted extremely nicely with great attention to detail. Unfortunately, the sword grip is partially destroyed, but we can see that there was some kind of grip binding. The depiction of a sword grip that is much better preserved can be seen with the cenotaph of Wieprecht von Greutsch in Pegau. The grip is wider at its base near the crossguard and then tapers up to the pommel. So you can clearly see the sword grip's cross-section here. It is indeed rectangular with chamfered edges. The grip is very densely wound with some kind of thread or thong, and on top of that there are what looks like leather thongs zigzagging from the crossguard up to the pommel, and they're interlacing each other, forming lozenge or diamond shapes. The cenotaph was put up somewhere in the 1220s, some 100 years after Wieprecht had actually died. And then in the 19th century, a copy was made. You can see a replica of this copy reflecting the state in the 19th century in the Archaeological Museum in Chemnitz. It gives us an even clearer idea of what the weapons and the costume portrayed actually looked like in their heyday. On this double page from my book of Sword and Shield, which I have been working on for a couple of years now, you see a Brazil nut pommel sword in its scabbard. The grip binding resembles the one that we have just seen on the cenotaph of Wieprecht von Greutsch, and the scabbard is a reconstruction of a surviving fragment at Bamberg, the so-called scabbard of St. Hadrian, and here you see a reconstruction of what it might have looked like at around 1100. What is interesting to note is that this is another sword which has some irregularities regarding hilt design, which probably were intentional to increase functionality of the sword. So in order to improve ergonomics, the sword was optimized for the gripping hand, and the gripping hand, of course, is not symmetrical. So whenever you pick up something and say a screwdriver or something that you actually need to extend, could be a knife or whatever, and you extend it forward, then there's one side where you put the thumb, and then on the opposing side it is enclosed by the remaining fingers. So by default you have a finger side and a thumb side, as I call it. And if you adopt such a precision grip, like when you are putting a key in a lock or cutting a slice of bread, then it is helpful to have a hilt that actually accommodates the hand and makes up for its asymmetry. And the way that historical sword makers actually made up for the fact that on the one side they have this aesthetic ideal of symmetry, and then on the other you need to accommodate an asymmetrical hand, these strategies that were used by them consist of various factors, various aspects. So first off, with this pommel here, you see that it's actually not exactly in the central axis of the sword. So it's slightly shifted to one side. It's not as apparent with this particular example, but if you look at the probably somewhat earlier sword, which now is kept in Hamburg, then it's quite clear that there's a short pommel side and a long pommel side. And it's fair to assume that the longer side would give more of a lock, so to speak, for the fingers, which require more space on their side of the handle than does the thumb. This is a strategy that is not unique for Brazil nut pommel swords. You can actually also observe it with a lot of other swords from the early Middle Ages. Like for instance these type V swords from Gnezdovo in Russia. You can see that all the pommels are moved to one side. So there's a strategy, an intentional purpose to move the pommel out of the central axis. So this defines the finger side and the thumb side, and therefore also the long edge or true edge and the short edge or false edge. Okay, so with these swords, even though they appear to be symmetrical, we have by default a cutting edge that faces downwards and one that faces up, like with complex hilted swords of the Renaissance. By default, you actually know how to hold them. And like with Renaissance swords, there are left-handed and right-handed swords here too. Now this one is a right-handed sword. You can tell when you pick it up that it nicely accommodates a right hand. You can find out when you completely extend the sword. Because when you extend it, you can see that you can nicely align the edges, particularly the one facing down, the so-called long edge, with the ulna, which is optimal for cutting. And this is because the pommel is actually twisted. And this is something that I've noticed on pretty much all the swords that I have examined by now, or almost all the swords. Depending on pommel design, sometimes it's not actually required to twist the pommel, but why do I have to turn the pommel anyway? Well, the reason is that when you actually pick up something and you extend it forward and you have to hold it fast, then the fingers on the bottom side, as you extend your knife or your sword forward, will inevitably pull the grip towards the palm, where it actually presses against the big muscle, the big lump of muscle at the base of the thumb. Now this muscle presses the top side, the upper edge of the grip away from the palm, and this results in a twist. It's usually a twist of about anything between 2 and 5 degrees. The sword makers made up for that by twisting the pommel to begin with. So with this right-handed sword, if you hold it, if you pick it up and you extend it forward, then there is not a problem with blade or edge alignment. So you don't have to turn your wrist, which would be suboptimal, as martial arts wants to use the body and any weapon that you hold to their optimum. And you can actually make the litmus test. So taking this sword into the left makes things worse. Because the pommel is twisted. Now, as I hold the sword and extend it forward, the blade is even more severely angled to one side. And this, of course, is not good. So with the SININIS sword, we see three very typical inaccuracies or irregularities of hilt design. The pommel is shifted somewhat out of the central axis. It is tilting to one side, and it is also twisted. Which begs the question if there are any alternative explanations for this other than intentional design. Well, if this was the case, then we would have to expect a statistically equal distribution of such irregularities. But if we look at twisted pommels, then you will see that this is not the case. There is a majority of pommels with a counterclockwise twist and only a minority of maybe 15 or 20% with a clockwise twist. So if it was not intentional, we would see a 50-50 distribution, but instead we see a distribution which rather matches the distribution of left-handers in professional sports, for instance, like boxing or so. So 20 to 80% right-handers, 20% left-handers. Now, another question or another option could be that if we look at the twisted pommels, that maybe this comes by use, so that the stress on the Tang slightly twists it over the years as the sword is being used. If this was the case, then you would see twisted Tangs rather than only pommels that are turned into a position that is at an angle. And again, I have seen a lot of twisted pommels, or rather say pommels that are set into the Tang at an angle, then twisted Tangs. Yeah, so if you, for instance, look at this probably 14th century sword from Lübeck, then you can see that the surface of the Tang is absolutely smooth. The opening, the cavity at the bottom side of the pommel is typically somewhat larger, and here we see shims that have been used to fasten the Tang on the bottom side. And now if we turn the sword around and look at the pommel from the top, you can see that the Tang is pinned over the pommel top, and it's a very accurate job that was done here. The sides of the Tang and the respective opening have been meticulously shaped, but they are at an angle. So this is nothing that could come from use. This is something that was done by the craftsman who mounted the sword, and therefore it must have been intentional. Of course, you could argue that maybe they were just inaccurate when making these openings, but that is not convincing because the pommels and the hilts were so meticulously and precisely crafted and designed that it simply doesn't make sense to assume that when it comes to placing a cavity, an opening in the pommel plate in the upper guard, they cocked up and were unable to place it at the correct angle. Moreover, there are examples of surviving pommels that are very accurately and precisely crafted. But if you closely look at the ornament, the decoration of the pommel, which appears to be symmetric, you will note that even this decoration is actually shifting to one side to cover up the fact that the pommel is actually, or the hilt is actually not symmetrical, even though the aesthetic ideal was supposed to be kept up. The illusion of symmetry, so to speak. It neither is convincing to assume that craftsmen would be able to make perfectly symmetrical blades and keep really nice edges and then cock up when it comes to producing a symmetrical tang. So some tangs are actually shifted to one side to begin with, and other tangs are not symmetrical, but one side is at a stronger angle than the opposing one, which of course would result in a position of mounting the pommel that is set out of the central axis. There are also other great examples that show this purposeful asymmetry that would improve the ergonomics of the sword. If, for instance, you look at this sword from near Hedeby, then you can see that the upper guard is obviously asymmetrical, with one terminal being decisively longer than the other one, creating a finger side and a thumb side. Here's another great example, an X-ray of a sword that was discovered in the harbor of Hedeby too. And with this one you can clearly see that the tang and the pommel are not symmetrical. In my opinion, the high level of craftsmanship and the precision that went into the making of these swords rules out the option that the irregularities of the hilts can be accounted for the inaccuracy of manual labor. Furthermore, if you take into account the fact that the irregularities that I have observed with single-handed swords of the medieval period actually improve their handling characteristics, and that secondly, Sue Brunning found wear marks on pommels of early medieval swords that exactly match the kind of marks that were produced in an archaeological experiment of mine, then the best explanation for the irregularities in early medieval hilt design is that they were intentional, and that the intention was to improve the handling characteristics, the ergonomics of the sword. And this, in turn, leads to the conclusion that fine motor skills were crucial to swordsmanship in the early medieval period, and of course also later, as we can see in respective fencing treatises, fighting treatises from the late medieval period and the Renaissance. I think this is a really exciting insight into historical sword fighting and the skills and proficiency that were required to use these weapons. And this begs the question, at which point in history, in the history of sword fighting, did this start to actually matter? When did the sword makers come up with designs like this? And it seems like this is predating the early medieval period by far, because only recently it has been brought to my attention that there are specific irregularities in the design of Bronze Age swords too. Now, I have not paid much attention to Bronze Age swords thus far. I only went through my records very quickly and checked my video footage that is in my archives, and I found this short sequence. You can see a number of Bronze Age swords, and it looks like at least two of them have pommel plates that are sitting on the handle at an angle. But of course, it would require more research to actually validate this observation. Whenever you are going to museums or looking up swords in books and pay attention to this detail, just let me know. I'm most interested in your observations too. And finally, a word about the overall design of the SININIS sword. It does adhere to a geometrical and purposeful design as suggested by sword researcher and sword maker Peter Jonsson. And as you can see, it follows one of his basic structures, namely basic design structure 1. And this one comes with a ratio of hilt to blade of 1 to 6. And from this ratio, from this circle that uses the length of the hilt as a diameter, you can actually design all the other remaining stats of the sword by using a straight edge and a compass. If you want to know more about this sword or other specimens that I have examined, you may care to note that the stats, photos and drawings are available to respective patron tiers. Find according links in the caption of this video. And thank you very much for your interest and your attention, and of course your support via Patreon.